The dirt hadn't moved in years. That's what James Halberd kept telling himself as he stared out over the patch of land that had once fed his family and four others besides. The Kansas sun had long since burned the softness from it, leaving behind only cracked lines and dust that blew sideways in the wind like ash. He tried everything: rotating crops, prayer meetings, borrowed machines, old-school composting tricks from magazines nobody read anymore. But no matter how deep he dug, the earth didn't respond. It just sat there, angry, dry, and tired. He used to rise with the sun, motivated by the promise of harvest. Lately, he woke out of habit, not hope. The boots by the back door were starting to crack at the seams, not from work but from disuse. He still kept the calendar up, though. Emily had written the holidays in blue ink before she passed. Easter, their anniversary. Her handwriting was soft, looping. He left it there because erasing it felt wrong. That morning, James stepped out onto the porch just after 6. The sky was pale, the kind of clean light that made shadows long and quiet. He didn't expect anything to be different. But as he took his first sip of black coffee, he saw it. A shape tall, pale, unfamiliar, standing in the middle of the northern field near the broken irrigation line. His first thought was that someone had dumped a mannequin. Kids from town maybe, trying to stir up nonsense. But it didn't look plastic. It didn't even look real. He set the mug down and walked toward it, the gravel crunching beneath his boots louder than it should have been. The wind picked up behind him but didn't seem to touch the figure. It stood perfectly still, white as chalk against the backdrop of dead crops and gray soil. As he got closer, the details came into focus: folded robes, arms outstretched, a head bowed slightly, face calm. He stopped. Not out of fear, out of something else. Something deeper. It was a statue. Marble, by the look of it. The Virgin Mary, he realized. Not a replica, not a church prop. This was carved with care, with reverence. She stood half sunk in the earth, as though placed there gently and deliberately. No base, no foundation, no tracks, no indentations. Not a single footprint in the dirt surrounding her. Just her. Like she'd risen from the field itself. James stared at her for a long time, hands in his pockets, not blinking. The statue didn't glow, didn't speak, didn't move. But the air around her felt thicker, cooler somehow. And then he noticed something even stranger. The ground beneath her wasn't dry. It was damp. Rich, dark, living soil. James knelt, touched the dirt with one calloused hand, and brought his fingers to his nose. Moist. Clean. And just beside the statue's left foot, something green had broken through. A sprout. Alive. He exhaled, quietly. The land had finally moved. By noon, James still hadn't gone back inside. He sat on the rusted metal bucket near the edge of the field, elbows on his knees, staring at her. The statue hadn't shifted, hadn't sunk further. It just stood there, as if it always had. The sun was stronger now, casting a high white light that should have made the marble harsh and glaring. But somehow it didn't. The figure remained soft in tone, almost gentle. The shadows from her outstretched arms curved like an embrace across the cracked earth. He didn't know much about statues. Emily had liked art, but James was a man of fences and rainfall. Still, he knew good craftsmanship when he saw it. Whoever carved this had done so with hands full of reverence. Her robes flowed in delicate folds. Her face wasn't blank like so many religious figures. This one looked like it felt something. Sadness, maybe. Or understanding. She didn't look at him directly. Her eyes were lowered, focused somewhere between his boots and his heart. The base was missing. No plaque, no inscription. Just smooth marble rising from the ground like she'd been planted, not placed. And around her, the earth had changed. James dug a little with his fingers, pulled up handfuls of soil. Damp, yes, but not muddy. It was soft, fresh, like the field had remembered how to breathe. He sniffed it. No trace of rot or chemical burn. He thought of the soil tests he'd done 2 years ago, the ones that came back stamped with red warnings about alkalinity and depletion. That field had been dead. And now, beneath a statue that no one could explain, it wasn't. Eventually, James stood. His knees popped as he rose, reminding him he wasn't 40 anymore. He brushed the dirt off his jeans and slowly walked a wide circle around the statue, scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. No truck tracks, no footprints, no drag marks, not even a scuff in the dust. It made no sense. You don't just wake up to find a statue of the Virgin Mary standing in your field with no clue how it got there. Not unless someone put it there. But the land told a different story. It hadn't been moved. It had been still, undisturbed. It was as if she'd grown there, like a tree. Later that day, James made a few calls. Just quiet ones. A friend down at the co-op. An old neighbor named Todd. He didn't say much, just asked if anyone had lost a religious statue. They laughed. One said maybe it was a sign. Another joked that the Pope must have gotten lost on the highway, but James wasn't laughing. Not really. When the calls ended, he walked back to the statue and stood at her feet. His voice was low but steady. "If you're real," he said quietly, "I need to know why now." The wind didn't answer, but it changed direction. And far above, a hawk circled once then flew east, away from the drought. By the next morning, it wasn't just one sprout. James counted 6. All of them clustered around the statue's base, pushing through soil that had, until 2 days ago, refused to yield anything but brittle roots and disappointment. The shoots were small, tender, but unmistakably healthy, bright green and proud, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment to surface. He knelt beside them again, hands resting on his knees, and stared at the delicate veins in each leaf. He hadn't planted anything in that stretch of field since spring. It had been a half-hearted attempt, one last try before he gave up for good. He couldn't even remember what he'd buried in that soil. Maybe beans, maybe corn. Whatever it had been, he'd done it out of obligation, not belief. At the time, it felt like dropping seeds into a grave. Now they were growing. He touched one gently. The leaf was soft and smooth, the kind of fresh growth you couldn't fake. He looked back at the statue. Her head was still lowered, her expression unchanged. But somehow, she seemed more alive than yesterday. The marble almost shimmered in the morning light. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a trick. Something was happening. He stood and wiped his hands on his jeans, the same jeans he'd worn for 5 days straight. He didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt his chest expand with something other than frustration or grief. He didn't have a name for it yet, but it lived somewhere between awe and suspicion. Hope, maybe. A fragile, risky kind of hope. Later that day, he walked to the old shed behind the barn. It had once been his tool house, then Emily's potting shed. Now it mostly held dust and rusted things. He rummaged through a cracked cabinet and found a faded plastic marker stake. He brought it back to the field and planted it beside the tallest sprout, not to mark it for study, but for remembrance. If the growth continued, he wanted to know exactly where it had started. At sunset, he returned again. The sky burned with gold and pink as he stood watching the light slide across the field. The sprouts glowed faintly in the fading warmth. Around them, the soil remained dark and damp. No rain had fallen. No irrigation had run. And yet the earth was soft and giving. He sat beside the statue and rested his back against her pedestal. For the first time in a long while, he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to feel. The wind brushed his face. The ground smelled alive. And somewhere deep inside, a man who had buried more dreams than seeds began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, something sacred had taken root where his sorrow used to be. He didn't call anyone, but they came anyway. The first was Kenny Marshall, driving by slow in his pickup on the way to the feed store. James had seen him pause at the edge of the road, squinting at the distant figure in the field. A few hours later, Kenny was back, this time on foot, hat in hand, eyes wide. He didn't ask to walk out. He just followed the same path James had carved through the brittle grass and stood there, 10 feet from the statue, saying nothing. James watched from the porch, arms folded. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, the sudden attention, or the fact that he didn't mind it as much as he thought he would. Something about the way Kenny stood there, head slightly bowed, hands gripping his hat like a prayer book, reminded James of the old days at church, the ones before the drought, before the silence. The next day, a few more came. Marcy and Donnie Taylor, Sheila from the post office, a retired couple who lived 2 farms down. No one asked to come. No one brought cameras. They just showed up, walked the path, and stood in the stillness. Some of them knelt, some cried. No one touched the statue. By the weekend, the visitors were steady, never more than a handful at a time. A quiet parade of neighbors, distant relatives, and strangers with stories in their eyes. They parked respectfully along the gravel road, kept their voices low, and walked like they were entering a chapel. James said little. He wasn't the kind to narrate or explain. He just sat on the porch or leaned against the barn, watching them come and go like tides. He noticed patterns. The old stayed longer, the young looked confused. Mothers brought children, and the kids often seemed drawn to the statue in a way they couldn't explain. One boy, no more than 5, reached toward her and whispered, "She's not cold." His mother pulled him back gently. James didn't intervene. He didn't understand what was happening. Not fully, but he knew enough not to interfere. Something sacred was unfolding. That Sunday, James lit a candle. not at the church. He hadn't stepped foot in there since Emily's funeral. He lit it right there in the field, placing it carefully in an old glass jar from the shed. He set it at the base of the statue and watched the flame flicker in the evening wind. It should have gone out, but it didn't. The visitors kept coming, each one quieter than the last, not seeking miracles, not asking questions, just standing, just listening. And James began to wonder if silence was the only language that could truly hold whatever this was. Because in all their stillness, no one asked what she was doing there. They already knew. 3 days had passed without a single cloud in the sky, and yet the ground beneath the statue remained dark and rich. James had checked the weather reports twice a day, sunny, dry, and wind speeds rising, but each morning, when he walked out into the field, he'd find the same quiet miracle. The soil at her feet was always damp, not soaked like irrigation, damp like the kind of deep, even moisture that farmers pray for all summer. The strangest part was how far it spread. At first, it was only a few feet around the base of the statue, just enough to hold the cluster of sprouts. But now the dampness reached farther 10 feet, maybe 15, seeping outward in a slow, natural ripple. The dirt held together in his hands, cool and fragrant. He hadn't smelled earth like that in years. Not since before Emily got sick, not since he believed in anything more than survival. That morning, he crouched beside the statue and ran his hand along the ground. The texture was soft, spongy, the way healthy topsoil should be. He scooped a handful and let it fall through his fingers. Black, full of life. A few beetles crawled lazily across the clumps. Worms had returned. James hadn't seen worms in this field since 2019. He stood slowly, scanning the rest of the land. Beyond the wet radius, the earth was still pale and cracked, sun-beaten into lifelessness. But inside this circle, inside the space, the statue had claimed it was like the land was dreaming again, like it had remembered what it meant to give. By noon, more visitors had come. A pair of sisters from 2 towns over, an older man in a faded veteran's cap, a girl no older than 16 who stood barefoot in the soil and cried for 20 minutes without speaking. James didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Their eyes said it all. They weren't there to take, they were there to feel. That night, James stayed out late. He brought a folding chair from the shed and set it just behind the statue, not to watch her, but to keep her company. The moon rose slow and full, casting silver across the field. And then, just after midnight, he saw it. Dew, not everywhere, just there, around her. He stepped off the path and knelt. Droplets clung to the leaves of the sprouts, beaded like glass pearls. The air was dry, no mist, no breeze. But somehow, this one patch had drawn moisture from nothing, or maybe from something else entirely. He looked up at her face, still calm, still silent. "You're feeding it," he whispered. The statue didn't answer, but the candle in the glass jar flickered once, then burned steady again. And James, kneeling in the dirt, felt something in his chest break open. Not pain, not joy, something older, something sacred. A prayer that had never left his lips, finally being answered without words. It was just after dusk when Clarissa Wheeler pulled up in her rust-bitten minivan, the engine clicking softly as it cooled. She climbed out with her daughter asleep in the back seat, cheeks flushed, skin damp with fever. James recognized the look in her eyes, half desperation, half disbelief. He didn't say anything as she unbuckled the child and cradled her small frame against her shoulder, whispering promises that only a mother makes when she's run out of everything else. She walked the path without asking. Everyone did now. It had become understood this was no longer James's field, not in the way it had been. The land, the air, even the silence belonged to something older, something watching. Clarissa stepped into the circle of rich soil, her shoes sinking just slightly as she reached the statue. She didn't kneel, didn't pray aloud. She simply stood there, rocking her daughter gently in her arms, the child's fevered breath warming her neck. James stayed back, far enough to give space, but close enough to hear if she called. But she didn't. She just stayed, wrapped in the strange, still grace that the statue seemed to hold in its very stillness. The sky darkened. Crickets returned. Somewhere, a dog barked faintly. And still, Clarissa didn't move. It was almost 30 minutes before she finally turned around. Her daughter was still asleep, but her color had changed. The redness had faded, her tiny hands no longer clenched in that restless way sick children hold. Clarissa paused halfway back to the car and looked at James. "She hasn't been quiet like this in 2 days, she said. Her fever wouldn't drop." James nodded slowly. "You think it was the air?" Clarissa hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I think it was her," she said, glancing back toward the statue. He didn't press her, didn't offer science or caution. He'd stopped trying to explain things days ago. The next morning, Clarissa called. Her daughter's fever had broken completely overnight. She was sitting up in bed eating crackers and asking about cartoons. She says she had a dream, Clarissa added. Said she saw a lady made of sky and white stones. Said she touched her hair and sang without sound. James held the phone against his ear, eyes fixed on the field. More stories followed. A boy with a chronic cough stopped coughing after his family visited. A woman whose hands had trembled for years said they were steady for the first time after standing barefoot in the circle. None of them were loud about it. No one claimed miracles out loud. They simply came, stayed, and left changed. The field remained quiet. No fire, no trumpets, just the slow unfolding of something unexplainable. And James, who once thought he'd seen the end of everything, now watched as life returned to places long abandoned, not just in the ground, but in people's faces, especially in the mothers. They never came just to look. They came to hope. And for the first time, it was enough. They began to arrive earlier in the day now and later into the night. Some came before work, stepping quietly through the grass as the sun crept over the hills. Others came after supper, headlights dimmed, walking the path in pairs or alone. It was never a crowd, never noisy, always quiet, always respectful. James called them the Watchers in his mind, though they never gave themselves a name. They weren't tourists. They didn't come to gawk or gossip. They didn't ask for anything. They simply showed up and watched. Watched the field, watched the statue, watched each other, and not in judgment, but in reverence. Like they were all seeing something they didn't quite have the words for. And perhaps that was the whole point. This wasn't something meant to be explained. It was meant to be experienced. One older man came every evening at 6 sharp, wearing the same pressed shirt and tie, even in the heat. He never spoke, just stood with his hat over his chest for 15 minutes, then turned and left. A young woman came barefoot, carrying a sketchbook filled with soft charcoal drawings of the statue, each page a little more detailed than the last. A father brought his teenage son once, then again, and then again until one night, the boy walked the path alone. James started recognizing their rhythms. He didn't talk much. He'd nod, sometimes raise a hand, but mostly he stayed on the porch or leaned on the fence, letting them come and go as they needed. He'd learned that silence said more out here than any sermon ever could. Sometimes, the watchers would bring something. Candles, mostly. Small ones in jars or wax pillars wrapped in foil. They'd place them gently at the statue's base and light them without fanfare. The flame would catch, flicker once, and then hold always steady, even in the wind. A few brought flowers, nothing grand. Wildflowers mostly, or whatever was left in their gardens. Once, a woman brought a pair of worn baby shoes, set them down, and cried without sound. James didn't ask. The field had become something else now. It wasn't just land, it was listening, breathing, holding the weight people carried in ways James couldn't explain. In the statue, she remained still, unchanged, and yet present. Like she knew. He walked the path himself sometimes at night, after everyone had gone. He'd stand there, just as they did, and let the air press against his skin. Sometimes he'd whisper to her, nothing special, just thoughts, worries, regrets, thanks. The ground still glowed faintly in the moonlight, not with light, but with life. One evening, as he made his way back to the house, he looked over his shoulder and paused. The field behind him was empty. No one there, no movement. But he didn't feel alone. He felt watched. Not by people, by something kinder, something older, something still watching back. James hadn't dreamed in months. Not real dreams, the kind that settle in your chest and stay with you long after you've woken up. His sleep since Emily passed had been shallow, more exhaustion than rest. But that night, something shifted. He went to bed with the window cracked open, listening to the wind in the corn, the faint rustle of stalks that had no business being so tall this early in the season. The field had changed. He could feel it, even in the dark. The dream began in silence. He was standing in the middle of the field, barefoot, the soil soft and warm beneath his feet. The moon was high, yet everything glowed as if bathed in sunlight. There was no sound, no crickets, no breeze, no hum of distant trucks, just a golden stillness. And in that stillness, she appeared. Not the statue, the woman. She stood where the statue should have been, but she was not made of marble. She was light, not blinding, not ethereal, just soft, steady, glowing from the inside out. Her robe flowed like water in slow motion. Her eyes were deep, Endless, but not frightening. They were knowing. She looked at James but didn't move, didn't speak. And yet, he heard her, felt her. "This land was never yours," she said, though her lips didn't move. "But your promise made it mine." James wanted to respond, but his mouth wouldn't open. There was no fear in him, just a deep ache. Something between guilt and relief. She stepped forward, and as she did, the crops around her seemed to straighten, reaching toward her like children to a mother. The ground itself shifted, darkened, healed. He felt it through his feet, like a heartbeat in the soil. He looked down, and the sprout he'd seen days ago was now a stalk, full-grown and strong. Another step, and more plants surged upward, as if pulled by her presence alone. He dropped to his knees in the dream, tears wetting the collar of his shirt. He didn't know why he was crying, only that he was full of sorrow, of memory, of awe. He remembered Emily then, how she used to pray over the land when he was too tired to try, how she believed in things he couldn't see. When he looked up again, the woman had reached out her hand. Her palm hovered just inches from his face, warm and still. She didn't touch him. She didn't have to. He woke before sunrise, breath caught in his throat, heart pounding against his ribs like it wanted out. The sheets were damp, the windows still open, and outside, in the early morning light, the statue stood, unchanged. But James knew. It hadn't been a dream. Not really. It had been a memory. Hers. And she had come to remind him of the vow he made, long ago, when no one else had been listening but heaven. The letter came folded in thirds, tucked into a crisp white envelope with no return address, just the name of a development firm James had never heard of. He opened it on the porch with the early light falling across his boots. The language was formal, layered with terms like easement rights and resource access. But the message was clear. The company claimed historic rights to the mineral content beneath his property, and as part of a routine assessment, they would be inspecting the land, including the field. James read it twice, then once more with shaking hands. The field? After all this? After everything it had become? He tucked the letter into his back pocket and didn't tell anyone. 2 days later, a man arrived in a silver pickup, new, clean, wheels still dust-free. He wore polished boots, sunglasses that cost more than James's whole wardrobe, and carried a clipboard that looked heavy with consequence. He introduced himself as Ellis Rowan, a representative from the development group, and spoke with the kind of smile that never touched the eyes. "Mr. Halberd, we'll be bringing in equipment next week. Minor survey work, nothing invasive. Just a quick extraction plan review and possibly relocating the statue for safekeeping." James's jaw tightened. "Relocating?" Ellis nodded casually. "Yes, of course. It's technically unregistered and sitting on top of potential access routes. It won't be harmed. We'll move it to a more visible location by the road." James stared at him. "She's not a mailbox." The younger man blinked, thrown. "Excuse me? She doesn't need to be more visible. She's exactly where she's meant to be." Ellis chuckled nervously, adjusting his clipboard. "Mr. Halberd, I'm not here to debate theology. This is standard procedure." James said nothing, just turned and walked back toward the porch. "Sir," Ellis called after him, "the field doesn't belong to her." James stopped halfway up the steps, hand on the rail. "That's where you're wrong." He didn't slam the door, didn't shout, didn't make a scene. But something changed in his posture, in his silence. For the first time since she appeared, the peace of the field felt threatened. Not by storm or drought, but by man's hunger to possess what was never his to take. That evening, James walked to the statue and stood there a long time. The sprouts were now knee-high. The soil remained damp, untouched by machines, unshaken by talk of permits. He knelt, pressed his palm into the dirt, and whispered like a man making a promise he couldn't write down. "They're coming, but I won't let them move you." The air shifted around him. Still, warm, steady, as if something had heard, as if something had already begun preparing to stand its ground. The field did not shake. The statue did not weep. But somewhere beneath the surface, the earth began to gather itself like breath before a warning. The first truck arrived just after dawn, a flatbed rig hauling a small bulldozer and a pair of orange survey markers. Ellis Rowan stood near the driver's side, clipboard in hand, phone already pressed to his ear. James watched from the edge of the porch, a cup of black coffee untouched in his hand. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows over the field. The statue stood where she always had, bathed in soft gold light, calm, unmoving. 3 men got out of the truck, laughing casually at first. They'd clearly done this sort of job 100 times. Move a structure, break ground, follow orders. One of them waved to James without waiting for a response. He didn't return it. The bulldozer's engine fired up on the first turn, But as it rolled toward the field, the driver tapped the brakes and frowned. The machine stuttered. Then, halfway across the outer path, it simply stopped. No smoke. No grinding. Just silence. The man tried to restart it once, twice, then again, but nothing. The engine wouldn't even turn over. "Battery's dead," one of them muttered. Another popped the hood. "No way. It was at full charge this morning." Ellis walked over, irritation creeping into his voice. "Get it going. This is a time-sensitive job." The men swapped batteries from the truck. Still nothing. Then the second machine, a smaller earth mover, refused to start too. A thick silence fell over the field, not just awkward but strange. Even the birds seemed to hold back their songs. James walked slowly toward the statue, his boots leaving deep impressions in the soft soil. He didn't say anything, just stopped beside her and looked down at the base. The sprouts were taller now, the leaves brushing his knees. The soil beneath them was almost black, glistening faintly. He crouched, ran his fingers through it. Still damp, still warm. He turned and looked at Ellis. "I told you," he said evenly. "She's not going anywhere." Ellis didn't respond. He was too busy glaring at the machines like they'd betrayed him personally. One of the crew stepped back from the dozer and shook his head. "This thing worked fine an hour ago." James watched the man's face. He looked unsettled, not angry, but wary, like he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The driver muttered something about the air feeling heavier than usual. Another pointed toward the clouds forming in the east, strange, low-hanging ones that hadn't been there 15 minutes ago. Then one of the men stepped too close to the statue. The moment his foot touched the dark ring of soil, he stumbled back, gasping. "Something shocked me," he said, clutching his arm. "There's no power out here," the driver said. "Nothing to carry a charge." The crew fell silent. Ellis waved them off. "Let's pack it up. We'll bring in a full rig tomorrow." But as the truck pulled away, James stayed where he was, watching the sky. The clouds didn't follow them. They stayed directly above the field. The next morning, before sunrise, James returned to the field. The air was still, holding a weight that didn't come from temperature or storm. It felt like waiting. He stepped carefully along the path, his boots pressing into the softened ground, dew soaking into the cuffs of his jeans. The candle jar was still there, untouched, the wick blackened but dry. The sprouts had grown again overnight, at least 2 inches taller, greener, stronger. But something new caught his eye. Near the base of the statue, nestled between the roots of a growing stalk, bloomed a flower. Small, delicate, white. At first, he thought it might be a wild daisy or some wandering weed taking advantage of the good soil. But as he crouched closer, his breath caught. It wasn't native. Not to Kansas. Not to this climate. It was a bellflower Alpine, the kind you only saw in high elevations, in places with snow-fed water and rocky slopes. The petals curved inward like prayerful hands, and in the center was a faint trace of blue. Emily had once circled one in a gardening book and said she wished they'd grow here. Just once. James had told her they wouldn't survive the heat. Now here it was. He didn't touch it. He didn't dare. He just sat beside it, lowering himself slowly onto the damp ground, and stared until the light turned orange on the horizon. By noon, a few visitors had come and gone. Most didn't notice the flower. But one woman, elderly, leaning heavily on a cane, gasped when she saw it. "That's not from here," she whispered. "My grandmother used to have pictures of those in her prayer room, said they grew near old shrines in the mountains." James nodded but said nothing. The woman bent slightly and whispered something in Spanish, maybe a prayer, maybe a name. Then she backed away, careful not to let her shadow touch the petals. That night, James flipped through Emily's old gardening journal. She'd cataloged every flower she ever dreamed of planting, scribbling notes and drawing little sketches in the margins. Page 47. Campanula alpina. Too delicate, won't take root here. But beautiful. Would have liked to see one in real life. He closed the book slowly. She had, through him. He lit a candle by the statue and stayed until long after the others had gone home. The sky above was clear, stars scattered across the black like scattered seeds. But the air felt heavy again, like something sacred was pressing down from above. James looked at the flower once more, the soft white petals moving gently without wind. "This isn't just a blessing," he murmured. He realized it then, not everything blooming in that soil came from seeds. Some things were promises kept, quiet ones, made in tears, watered by grief. The kind of promises heaven never forgets. And now, the field had begun to remember too. It was in the canning shed that he found it. The place had sat untouched since Emily passed its wooden door swollen from years of humidity, its windows streaked with dust, and its shelves still lined with rusted lids and old jars marked with her careful script. Peach 2013. Apple butter. Dill pickles. Extra brine. James hadn't been able to step inside since the funeral. It was hers, too much hers, and he'd let the seasons cover it in silence. Until now. He hadn't intended to go in. Something pulled him there. Maybe it was the flower. Maybe the dream. Maybe the weight he'd been carrying since the machines failed and the sky changed. But that morning, he unlocked the door, pushed it open with his shoulder, and stepped into the stillness. The scent of dust and time wrapped around him. He stood for a long moment before moving. Then, with slow hands, he began sorting through the shelves. The jars were sealed, the labels faded. A blanket still hung on the back wall, the one she used when she sat out here in the evenings. Her handwriting was everywhere, dates, measurements, prayers. He touched each item like it might vanish if he held it too tight. Then he found the box. It was small, metal, rusted at the corners, wedged between two crates of unused lids. He pulled it free and opened it slowly. Inside were old seed packets, a pair of gloves, and a folded envelope sealed with yellow tape. His name wasn't on it, just a date. March 14, 2021. Over a year before she died, his breath caught. He sat down on the old stool and peeled the tape back carefully. The paper inside was thin, worn soft by time, but the ink was clear. Emily's handwriting. James, if you're reading this, then the time came. Maybe it came quietly. Maybe it came like thunder. I don't know how or when, but I saw her. I saw her standing in the field, where we always wished something would grow. She wasn't marble then. She was light. I think she's coming to finish something we started. Don't be afraid. Just remember, what we plant in faith doesn't always bloom on time, but it blooms. I love you, always did. He read it 3 times. When he looked up, the light in the shed had changed. It poured through the dusty glass in long golden beams, catching the edges of jars, the faded fabric of her apron, and the corner of his weathered face. He pressed the letter to his chest and closed his eyes. All this time, he thought he'd lost her to silence. But Emily had been speaking all along through dreams, through seeds, through letters the earth waited to reveal. He stood, folded the note, and walked to the field. He didn't place it at the statue's feet. He placed it in the soil, right where the first sprout had grown. And the dirt, somehow, felt warmer there. That night, James couldn't sleep. Not from worry, not from fear, but from something deeper. Something that stirred beneath his ribs like memory returning home. He lay in bed with the window open, listening to the quiet hum of crickets and the slow breath of the land outside. The letter sat on the table beside his bed. He'd unfolded it twice since sunset, not to reread it, but to feel her handwriting again. To trace the loops of her Y's, the way she dotted her I's with careful intention. She'd always written like she was praying. He rose before dawn, pulled on his boots, and walked the path to the statue. The field glowed with a strange kind of stillness. Not empty, but full. Full of something he couldn't name. Life, maybe, or memory. He knelt in the dirt, not out of obligation, but instinct. That's when he remembered. The hospital room had been dim. The machines had beeped with soft indifference. Emily's hand was thin, her grip weak, but her eyes were still alive. He had leaned close to her and whispered the words only they had heard. If you go first, I'll take care of this land. I'll keep it for you. Even if nothing grows, I'll keep it. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. Just words. Just comfort for a dying woman. But now, kneeling before a statue that had appeared in dead soil and brought life back with it, James understood. It hadn't been a gesture. It had been a vow. And heaven had heard it. He looked up at her, the statue, the stillness, the strange presence that had changed everything. He wasn't sure if she was listening. He wasn't even sure if she was what people thought she was. But she was here. That much he knew. And something had answered. A breeze lifted through the field, soft and slow, bending the sprouts that now stretched past his knees. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. His chest felt full, not heavy full, like something lost had come back. Not just Emily, not just the promise, but the version of himself he thought had died with her. The man who believed. He didn't say a prayer. He didn't need to. The earth was doing it for him now. Every blade of green, every silent visitor, every candle placed at her feet was part of a larger language, and he was learning to speak it again. When he rose to his feet, the sun was just cresting the horizon. Light spilled across the field in golden ribbons. He turned back toward the house, the dirt soft beneath his boots, and smiled. The land was no longer dead, and neither was his word. He hadn't just made a promise to Emily, He'd made a promise to something far bigger, and now the earth had begun to answer with every breath of green. In the weeks that followed, the transformation wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, steady, like a patient breath that never stopped drawing in. The once barren soil didn't just grow sprouts now, it grew life. Full rows of cornstalks stood strong, where nothing had survived for years. Beans tangled up their wooden poles without being coaxed. Sunflowers bloomed near the fence line, wild and bright, even though no one had planted them. The field had become something new. James walked it daily now. Not to work it, not to manage it, just to be with it. He ran his hands through the tall grass like it was hair, knelt to touch the roots of plants he hadn't expected to see again in his lifetime. The soil was warm. It gave easily under his boots. The worms had returned in droves. Bees came, birds came. Deer stood at the edge of the trees and didn't run when they saw him. He kept thinking of something Emily used to say, "The earth remembers who listens to it." He hadn't listened for years. He'd cursed it, pounded his fists into its dead dust, swore it had turned its back on him the way God had. But now, as he walked past the rows of impossibility, past a marble statue that still hadn't shifted even an inch, he realized the truth. The soil had never forgotten him. It had just waited. One morning, he noticed the circle around the statue had expanded. The rich black soil had stretched farther into the field, swallowing patches of dry ground without force. Just quiet persistence. The plants in that zone grew stronger, straighter. He touched the leaves and felt the difference: thicker stems, deeper roots. Like the land there carried memory. He dug once, curious. Not deep, just a few inches down. The smell hit him immediately, rich, dark, the scent of compost and rain even though it hadn't rained in 10 days. He brought the soil to his nose and paused. There was something else. Lavender. Emily used to grow it in pots near the back porch. Said it calmed the air. He'd torn them out after she died, unable to stand the scent. Now it was here again, rising faintly from the ground itself. He didn't cry, but he sat in the dirt for a long time. He pressed his palm to the ground and whispered, "I'm still here." And something, somehow, answered, not in voice, not in sound, but in warmth. In a wave of stillness that wrapped around him like her arms used to. The land was no longer just producing crops. It was healing, remembering, and every person who came, every step they took along the path, added to it. The field had become a memory that grew forward instead of backward. And James finally understood, you don't need stone tablets to hold a promise. Sometimes, it's held in dirt that forgives you for forgetting. He came with a camera and a smirk. Ethan Cole, a regional reporter from Wichita known for his skeptical takes on miracles, ghost stories, and holy water that turned out to be tap. He'd built a career on peeling back the curtain and showing the strings. James heard he was coming 2 days before he arrived. Someone from town tipped him off. Probably meant well, probably thought they needed someone to make sense of it all. Ethan showed up in jeans too clean for Kansas dirt and boots too new to have seen real work. He carried a leather-bound notebook, a shoulder bag with recording gear, and an expression that said he'd already decided what the story would be before he ever laid eyes on the statue. James didn't greet him, didn't have to. Ethan made his way down the path like every other stranger, had quiet at first, casual, with the easy confidence of a man sure he was about to uncover something explainable. But he slowed when he got close, slowed more when he saw the candles, slowed even more when his boots sank into the soil and he looked up at her face. He stood there a long time, longer than James expected. He didn't take a single photo. Later that evening, Ethan asked if he could speak with James. They sat on the porch, the sun bleeding orange across the corn. Ethan's voice was different now, gentler, like he wasn't sure of the ground beneath his questions. "What do you think it is?" he asked. James stared into the field. "I don't think it matters what I think." "You believe it's a miracle?" "I believe something's growing where it shouldn't. And people are healing in ways that don't make sense. Call it what you want." Ethan nodded, then hesitated. "I dreamed about her last night. Before I got here, I didn't know what she looked like, but in the dream, she was standing in a field. The same field." James didn't flinch. "A lot of folks have." Ethan was quiet for a while. Then he closed his notebook. "I was supposed to be here 2 days. I think I'll stay longer." He moved into the small inn on the edge of town, set up his equipment but barely used it. He came to the field every day, sometimes standing, sometimes kneeling, sometimes just walking the outer edges like he was learning the rhythm of something older than language. He never ran his story. Not the one he planned, anyway. James watched him soften day by day, watched the sharp lines of skepticism in his face give way to something gentler. It wasn't belief necessarily, it was reverence. That was enough. One evening, Ethan left a single page at the statue's base. James found it the next morning, folded once. It said only, "I didn't come to tell the story. I came to be part of it." And from that moment on, he was. They never called it a service. There were no bulletins, no schedules, no pastor standing at the edge of the path. But every evening, just before sunset, people came. They parked their cars along the gravel road, stepped quietly onto the field, and followed the now worn path between the tall stalks and wildflowers until they reached her. The statue, the heart of it all. The beginning of what no one dared to name. Some brought folding chairs. Others came with only a blanket or their own shadow. Candles were placed in the grass, each one lit with the kind of care reserved for funerals and births. They lined the base of the statue, sometimes forming a complete circle of flickering light. No one coordinated it. It just happened night after night. James stood back most of the time, near the fence or the edge of the barn, watching. He'd never seen this many people gathered in silence before. Not even at church. This wasn't organized. This wasn't led. It simply was. Children sat in their parents' laps. Teenagers stared at the sky like they were waiting for something. Men with calloused hands and stiff knees knelt without complaint. Women hummed low, tuneless melodies that filled the space between prayers. And always, there was stillness. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. A quiet that didn't feel empty. People didn't talk much. And when they did, it was with soft voices, barely louder than the wind. No one shouted, no one preached. They just stood together, as if the act of being near her and each other was enough to keep them upright in a world that kept trying to bend them. One night, a young woman stepped forward and sang. No microphone, no guitar, just her voice clear, aching, and full of something raw. It wasn't a hymn. It wasn't even in English. But the moment she began, the entire crowd stilled. Children stopped fidgeting. Even the cicadas quieted. And when she finished, no one clapped. No one moved. They just breathed. James lit a candle every night now. He didn't place it with the rest. He left it near the flower that had bloomed beneath her, the one that still hadn't wilted. Not even once. He whispered to her sometimes, not prayers exactly, but confessions, memories. Thanks. The statue remained unchanged. But the people didn't. James saw it in their posture, in their tears, in the way they lingered before walking back to their cars. Something was loosening in them, a grief, a fear, a need. And the field, his field, was no longer just his. It was theirs. A place to kneel without asking permission. A place where silence was holy. A place where no one had to explain why they came. Only that they did. Because somehow, without ever being told, they all understood. This was the kind of miracle you don't speak aloud. You simply show up and let it speak for you. He arrived at dusk, long after most had gone home. James was gathering the last of the candle jars, snuffing flames one by one as the stars began to blink awake in the sky. He almost didn't notice him at first, a silhouette against the amber horizon, tall and still as a fence post. The man didn't speak, didn't move, just stood on the edge of the field, just beyond the path, like someone uncertain whether he was allowed to step further. James called out, "You're welcome to walk through." The man nodded once, but stayed where he was. Something about him was different, not in the way he dressed, dark coat, worn boots, dust-covered hat, but in the way the air shifted around him, like he carried a storm he wasn't letting loose. Eventually, James approached him. "Evenin'," he said gently. The man looked up. His eyes were tired but sharp, like someone who'd spent years running from something, only to find it had been following him all along. "This where she is?" the man asked. James nodded. "That's her." The man's gaze turned toward the statue, still barely visible in the growing dark. "I heard," he said. "Didn't believe it, still don't." "You don't have to," James replied. "She's not asking for that." The man was quiet for a long while. Then he said, "I buried my daughter 2 years ago. Cancer. We stopped praying by the end. Couldn't stand the silence anymore." James didn't interrupt. "She used to draw the Virgin Mary," the man continued. "Over and over. Said she saw her in her dreams. Said she'd come one day and sit beside her bed. I told her not to be silly. That saints don't come to dying kids in Kansas." His voice cracked. "But what if I was wrong?" James placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Then maybe she came anyway." The man finally stepped forward, one slow foot after the other, like he was walking toward a grave he hadn't had the courage to visit. He followed the path without needing directions. And when he reached the statue, he collapsed, not from pain, but from release. He sank to his knees, hands trembling, shoulders heaving. No words, No cries. Just everything he'd held in too long finally finding somewhere to go. James stayed back. He'd learned not to intrude on moments like this. They belonged to the people who needed them. The man stayed until dawn. James saw him sleeping curled in the grass, arms wrapped around himself like a child. When the sun rose, the man stood, wiped his face, and placed something at the base of the statue. A drawing. A child's sketch of the Virgin Mary. James didn't ask his name. Some visitors needed to leave their names behind in order to find themselves again. And here, that was allowed. The harvest came early. James hadn't planned for it. The crops weren't on any schedule he recognized. But one morning, he stepped into the field and realized the stalks were bowing not from wind or weight, but readiness. Corn husks had split to reveal golden rows beneath. Beans hung thick and full. Even the wild sunflowers drooped under the burden of their seeds. It was as if the land itself had decided, now is the time. He brought no machines, no hired hands, just a basket and 2 old gloves that still smelled faintly of Emily's lemon balm. He worked in silence, careful with each pull, each cut, each collection. The soil was soft beneath his feet. There was no resistance. It gave what it had grown like an offering. By mid-morning, others arrived. Not to help at first, just to watch. But then someone stepped forward, Sheila from the post office, kneeling beside him with a soft, "Show me how." Then it was Donnie and Marcy. Then Kenny. Then Ethan, sleeves rolled and shoes kicked off. They didn't speak much, just worked together. And as baskets filled and arms grew tired, laughter bubbled up, small at first, but real. It felt like a feast before the table was even set. When the sun dipped low, they laid everything out on blankets: tomatoes, squash, carrots, ears of corn, so sweet they were eaten raw. No one had planned a meal, yet somehow there was enough. Bread appeared, jars of jam, a pitcher of sweet tea, plates passed from hand to hand. Children ran barefoot between the rows. A woman strummed a guitar softly, and all of it every moment happened in the shadow of the statue. Someone lit candles again. Someone else read from Psalms. But mostly people just sat in the fading light, full in a way that had nothing to do with food. James looked around the field and saw what it had become. Not just a place of growth, a place of return. Return to faith, to silence, to one another. As night fell, fireflies blinked to life like living prayer beads. The statue stood in the center, unchanged as ever, but somehow more alive than anything else. Her face caught the moonlight in a way that made it seem like she was smiling soft, knowing, eternal. James closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He didn't have to, because for the first time in his life, he felt it. The field was praying back, not in words, but in life, in harvest, in healing, in everything that should have been impossible, but now simply was. He opened his eyes to the quiet rustle of the wind through full stalks, to children sleeping in their mother's arms, to the soft murmur of old men telling stories they hadn't told in years. And he whispered, more to the air than anyone, "She came." And somewhere deep in the earth, something answered. She never left.